morning sun slowly peeked over the summit of Walden's Ridge and cast its first shadows across the valley. The animals were beginning to stir and celebrate the coming of a new day, and their voices mingled with the sound of water. There had been a good rain last week, and Troublesome Creek was still flowing strong. Granny Tollet sat on the front porch of the old cabin, gazing into the distance, taking it all in from her customary spot in her favorite chair. For the better part of the last 60 years, she had personally welcomed the sunrise from her throne with a hot cup of coffee. The dirt road that ran in front of her kingdom was full of activity today. First, there was Old Man Thomas, who had a wagon load of buttermilk, headed down to Flatland Country for the day. Then there was Reverend Harris, who was heading down to the Baptist church bright and early in preparations for the revival that was starting next week. Lord knows we need it, Granny Tollet thought to herself as she took another sip of coffee. About that time, hooves could be heard slowly coming, and then Granny could see the rider emerging in the distance, riding side straddle at a leisurely pace, mounted on a beautiful mare. It was Miss Virginia Lawson, all fixed up in her best dress and bonnet, and on her way to the general store. And as was the custom of the day, anyone who passed Granny Tollet's house had to stop and come sit a spell so Granny could catch up on all the local gossip and maybe even tell a story or two in the process. So, without any prompting, Miss Lawson hitched her horse at the gate and came strolling towards the cabin. Granny Tollet wasted no time getting down to business. "Well, when you getting married, Miss Virginia? Next year or the year after? Lord knows you best put it off as long as you can, if you ask me."
"Well, good morning, Miss Tollet. It's so good to see you, too."
But Granny had little time for greetings and pleasantries, and quickly returned to the question at hand. "Gal, I heard tell down at the quilting last week from all the wagging tongues that you had moved your wedding up to be this spring. But I gotta tell you, and I hope you don't mind me saying, but you'd be plumb wise to put it off just as long as you can. You know, getting married nowadays is a mighty risky thing to do. It sure is." Miss Lawson stood at the edge of the porch as Granny spoke, apparently waiting on an invitation. "Lordy me, where's my manners, child? Come on up here and rest your bones, and let me talk at you for a few minutes. I know you're powerful busy, and you probably got plans for this morning, but you know just as well as I do, it's best to always heed to good advice anytime you can get your hands on it. Anyways, like I done told you before, men folks, they is the devil just as sure as God made 'em. Law, child, I done seen it too many times. First, they sweeten you up and lure you in, and afore you know what happened, you got one leg tied down with a bunch of young'uns, and the other leg chained to the stove in the kitchen, while he props both his feet up, all easy like, enjoying a new plug of tobacco and reading his newspaper. And here you are, Miss Virginia, just itching to get yourself spliced just as soon as you can. That reminds me about that good-for-nothing Kayleen and that big wedding she had last fall. You remember Kayleen, don't you, Miss Virginia?"
"Well, I remember her when she was younger. She always seemed like a pretty good girl. I didn't realize she was married now."
"Well, she always had some mighty cute sort of ways when she was trying to get her own way, but that there gal behaves plumb ridiculous. Surely you remember Jerry Mosley, you know, Miss Rachel's son. I tell you, that boy, he was always destined to make something of himself. He always worked hard, and even though he didn't have no money, he was always clean and polite and level-headed. Why, if he'd had $1 to his name, I reckon all the gals would be crawling over each other just to catch his eye. Well, he was plumb crazy about Kayleen. He'd walk nearly 5 miles each day to go see her. And all the while, she was seeing that boy Silas McCoy. And you know them McCoy boys ain't no count. Never have been and never will be. And that boy Silas, he ain't never worked a day in his life. And all he does is spend his time playing the banjo or toting his gun around, terrorizing all the animals in the forest. Anyhow, Miss Sassy Kayleen was seeing both Jerry and Silas at the same time. And the worst part about it, Miss Virginia, was both of the boys knew it too. But instead of leaving her alone, they did all they could to outdo one another, trying to win Kayleen's love. Well, directly they had a big get-together over in Tri Cove, at a corn shucking and a quilting. All the gals in Troublesome Creek walked down there, and so did all the boys. And each boy took an extra horse with him, hoping to give a gal a ride home that evening. And as the party went on, every boy asked the gal to ride with him on the way back. And when it was all over, they all set out to come home. And do you know what she did, Miss Virginia? Well, this here Miss Kayleen told both Jerry and Silas that they could take her home after the party. And once the party was over, there stood Jerry and Silas, each of them a-holding his horse by the bridle. And nary one of them knowed who the other was waiting for. And when Kayleen got to the door and she saw them all standing there, she never said a word and just walked right past them and set out for home on foot, with both of those boys a-following her, a-leading their horses and a-quarreling, enough to take each other's heads off, I tell you, about which one was gonna ride with her, which none of them did. Finally, when Kayleen got to the creek, she needed one of them to help her cross that foot log, due to how slippery it was. Well, Jerry just happened to be the first one out on the log, and he took Kayleen by the hand, but once they got out in the middle of the log, Jerry spoke up. "Miss Kayleen, I got a great mind to just jump in that creek and drown myself." "Well, why would you want to go and do that, Jerry?" Kayleen said. "Well, 'cause you won't have me." Now, Kayleen, I don't believe she ever wanted Jerry, and she was probably just scared that if he jumped, she would accidentally fall with him and get her dress wet. "Well, you ain't ever asked me to be with you, not that I can recall." "Well, how about I ask you right here and now?" "Well, seeing the circumstances, I reckon it'd be all right to go steady. Besides, it don't make no sense to ruin your party clothes in the creek, much less drown yourself." And then Jerry took her by the hand and helped her across the log over the creek, and they walked holding hands the rest of the way. All the while there stood Silas, broken-hearted, and watching Miss Kayleen take Jerry's hand and walk away as a bona fide couple.
Get someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 2 volumes packed with stories that'll make your heart smile. Visit theappalachianstory.com to pick up your copy today.
And it weren't nary 2 weeks, and the tongues were wagging that Kayleen and Jerry was engaged to be married that summer. Well, anyways, honey, when Silas seen how things was, and he heard all that, he was bound to steal Kayleen back. So he took his rabbit foot, the one that he had killed in the graveyard, and he took it out of his pocket and crossed across his heart 3 times. And he vowed then and there that he would never let Kayleen get married to another man. And he said he knew just how he was going to fix things his way, because he knew Kayleen as well or better than Jerry did. So the next thing I know, here comes Silas McCoy walking up this road in front of my house with his best possum hunting dogs. And I said, "Silas McCoy, where you going at with that gun, boy? The persimmons ain't even ripe yet, and the animals ain't even stirring around yet." And then he said, "Miss Tollett, I'm aiming to do me a little possum hunting today." Now, you might not believe it, Miss Virginia, but I said right then and there, that boy's gonna try and win Kayleen back with the possum. That's right, just as sure as I'm sitting here right now. I tell you, Kayleen loved possum meat better than taters or hogs or anything else. I had never seen anything like it before. But it's the gospel truth, and afore long, there comes Jerry, walking down the road with his gun too, trying not to be outdone. But everybody on Troublesome Creek just shook their heads, because we all knew that Jerry was no count as a possum hunter, just as sure as you're born, child. Well, directly, Silas started dropping off possums at Kayleen's house like clockwork, and poor old Jerry, he begun to get scared that Kayleen would break off the engagement. So he hastened up the wedding and moved it up just as fast as he could. And I tell you, he had good reasons to be scared, because when the wedding day came, the whole community was gathered down at the Baptist church to watch Jerry and Kayleen get hitched. The sanctuary was packed, and they had to open all the windows, and Miss Penelope was playing softly at the piano. It was a right beautiful day for a wedding, just not theirs. Jerry and Kayleen had been kept away from one another that entire day on account of his bad luck to see the bride before she walks down the aisle. Well, anyways, all the while Jerry was slicking up his hair with cinnamon grease and trying to put his tie on, Miss Kayleen was in the other dressing room visiting with Silas, who had just brought her another big load of possums and gave the entire parcel of them to her. Now, if I hadn't have seen it myself, I'd have never believed it. But Kayleen could stand it no longer, and out the back door she went with Silas, while Jerry was smiling and all nervous like, standing at the altar, alone. We all just sat there. We didn't know no better. We was thinking that Kayleen was still in the back, putting on her wedding dress and fixing her hair, when directly Miss Penelope stopped playing the piano due to the sound of church bells ringing. But Miss Virginia, them bells weren't from the Baptist church. No, ma'am. They were ringing on the next hill over at the Methodist church. About that time, Kayleen's father come running through the door and told everyone that the wedding had been moved to the Methodist church. So the whole crowd, including Jerry, walked over to the other church. But when we all got there, there stood that two-timing Kayleen, standing at the altar with Silas. Poor old Jerry. He just stood at the back of the church and watched them say their vows. Wasn't a single thing he could have done to stop it. And no sooner than Silas kissed the bride, they had the biggest reception you ever saw under the yellow poplar tree in the churchyard. There were 7 tables all set up with all the possum you could imagine. Roasted, baked, fried, even possum casseroles. Me? Oh, I can't stand the thought of eating a single bite of it. So I just stood back and watched. And poor old Jerry, he nearly ate himself to death, trying to make believe like he didn't care. But if you ask me, gals don't seem to care for nothing these days, except for eating. And I'll tell you right now, Jerry was a heap better fella, a fine field hand, and he would have taken good care of Kayleen. And Silas, he was good for nothing, except for catching possums. And I always wanted to know just how they were going to live on possum the whole year round. That's what I want to know. Granny Tollett leaned forward in her rocking chair. Her voice was softer now, but no less firm. Now, Miss Virginia, you listen to me good. Life ain't always fair, and it ain't always kind. But the choices we make, they shape us, child, in ways that we can't even see coming. You take your time, and don't let nobody rush you into anything. Least of all, some man with sweet words and big promises. A good life is like a sunrise, steady, sure, and worth waiting for. And if you're lucky, you'll find someone who'll walk beside you, not ahead of you or behind you. And then you've got something rare. But if you don't find it, well, that's all right too. Ain't no shame in standing tall on your own 2 feet. Remember, Miss Virginia, you only get one heart. Be mighty careful who you hand it to. Granny Tollett took a long sip of her coffee, with her gaze fixed on the horizon. Now, go on to the store now, before I get started on another story. You know how I get. Granny chuckled, and the sound carried across the porch like the morning breeze, light and full of wisdom learned from a life well lived.